The smoke reached the porch before the alarm sounded, and Joel Harker stood frozen with his coffee still in hand as a full-grown lioness stepped out of the burning tree line and set a barely breathing cub on the dirt at his boots. She backed away 2 paces. She did not run. She did not roar. She looked at him like a person begging without words. Before we go any further, drop a comment telling us what part of the world you're listening from, and hit subscribe so stories like this one find you again. Joel's radio was still on his belt. His hand hovered over it for a full second before his fingers remembered how to move. He keyed the channel low, almost a whisper, and asked dispatch to page Dr. Angie Dowd to the North Ranger Station and to have her bring the emergency neonatal kit. He kept his eyes on the lioness the whole time. Her name was Delta. She was 12 years old, one of 4 African lions in the Redstone Wildlife Sanctuary Conservation Program. And in the 11 years Joel had worked at Redstone, she had never let a human being come closer than 50 yards. Now she was 10 feet away. The cub between them let out one thin sound and went quiet again. Joel could see the little ribcage moving fast and shallow under a coat of dust and smoke. He crouched down slowly, palms open. He had trained himself never to break eye contact with a big cat, but he broke it now because it felt like the right thing to do and because Delta was not looking at him like a predator, looking at prey. She was looking at him the way a person looks at a doctor when they have run out of other doors to knock on. The eastern ridge behind her was a wall of orange. The dry creek bed the forecasters had been warning about since June had not held the burn line the way anybody had hoped. Ash was already falling on the cabin roof, soft and grey, like the world had started snowing in the wrong season. Joel could smell the pine needles going up 2 miles away, and still Delta held her ground, planted in the yard like she had walked through a story and only had 1 page left to tell. Angie Dowd's truck came up the fire road 10 minutes later, tires flinging small rocks against the wheel wells. Angie was 34, sharp as a scalpel, and had been at Redstone for a little over 3 years. She had made a habit of never running, even to a call, but she was running now. She stopped short when she saw Delta, and her mouth opened and then closed again, and she set the neonatal kit on the ground with the same care a bomb tech uses on a soft package. "She's not defending," Angie whispered. "She brought him," Joel whispered back. "That's not what lions do." "I know what lions do. I've read the books." "So have I." "This isn't in the books." They worked out a plan in a series of low sentences and small movements. Angie would approach the cub, gloved, from the side furthest from Delta. Joel would keep talking, keep his hands where the lioness could see them, keep his own body between Delta and any sudden noise from the equipment. If Delta so much as shifted her weight, they would both back off and try again. They did not need to try again. Delta watched the whole procedure with those steady, amber eyes, and when Angie slipped the tiny oxygen mask over the cub's nose and the sound of the pump started up in the yard, Delta lay down. Just lay down, front paws crossed, head raised, the way an old barn dog lies down when the vet is finally in the room and the worrying part is done. "Joel," Angie said quietly, once the cub's breathing had steadied and she had the fluids running. "Joel, we have a problem. We've got about 6 of them. Bigger than that, look at his shoulder." Joel looked. There was a mark high on the cub's left shoulder, an old healed scar in a clean straight line, no more than 2 inches long. It was pale against the tawny coat. It was not a burn, it was not a claw mark, it was surgical. "That's not from tonight," Joel said. "That's not from any night in the last month," Angie said. "That's months old. Somebody cut this cub before we ever laid eyes on him." Joel felt the first cold thing settle low in his stomach. He looked back up at Delta. She was still watching him. The fire on the ridge was breathing louder now, pulling wind through the dry grass. The crews would be there in 20 minutes, maybe 30. He needed to get the cub inside, get Delta safely back through the service gate that stood open at the tree line, and radio the burn boss with an updated location. He needed to move, but he could not stop looking at that scar. "Angie," he said, "Delta hasn't had a cub in 6 years. Not since Dr. Rayner's ovarian workup. That was in her file." "I know what was in her file," Angie said, "and this cub is about 6 weeks old." They did not say what they were both already thinking. There was no room for it in that yard, not with the fire coming and the cub still working for every breath under the mask. Joel got up slowly and walked toward the open service gate, and Delta stood again, and the two of them moved down the path like they had done it 100 times before. She stayed 20 feet behind him the whole way, and when they reached the wide inner meadow that made up the safe part of her habitat, she stopped and turned back once, looking at the cub in Angie's arms. "He'll be okay," Joel said, and heard his own voice crack in the middle of it. "I promise you he'll be okay." He did not know then that he would spend the next 4 months making sure that promise held. By the time the fire crews had the eastern blaze pinned down against the old logging road, the cub was stable, on fluids, wrapped in a warming blanket in the station's back office. Angie sat with him for 2 hours straight. Joel stood at the window and watched the sky turn from orange to charcoal to a strange pale grey, and thought about the surgical scar on that little shoulder, and thought about Delta lying down at the sound of a medical pump, and thought about how the world had a way of handing you a puzzle when you were still holding your coffee. Delta went back into the acacia grove at the far end of her enclosure that same night. She did not fight the transfer. She did not vocalize. She walked slow and heavy, the way an animal walks when it has spent all of its adrenaline. Joel logged the event by hand in the paper duty book, the way old Marcus Rayner had taught him to when the computers went down. It occurred to him as he wrote it that Marcus Rayner had died 2 years earlier in what everyone called a hunting accident, and that Marcus had been the last person to update Delta's medical file. Joel closed the book. He set his pen down carefully. Somewhere out past the ridge, a coyote called once and did not call again. The next morning, Angie ran a full blood panel and a genetic profile on the cub. She did not tell Joel she was doing it. She did not need to. Joel already knew. He came into her lab at 8 in the morning with 2 cups of black coffee and set one on the counter next to her keyboard and said, "You ran it, didn't you?" "I ran it." "And?" Angie did not look up from the screen. "The cub isn't Delta's." Joel stood very still. "Say that again." "He isn't hers, not biologically. The mitochondrial line doesn't match her. It doesn't match any of our other 3 lions either. It doesn't match anything in our program." "Then whose is he?" "That," Angie said, finally looking up, "is the question that's going to get somebody in a lot of trouble." She turned the screen toward him. The genetic panel showed a lioness, an adult female, whose profile was in a shared database. The record had been anonymized under a private registration. Whoever had originally submitted the profile had used a shell name and a shell address, and that shell name lined up with exactly one commercial entity Joel had ever heard of: Whitmore Wildlife Holdings. Joel felt the coffee go cold in his hand. Rachel Whitmore had been Redstone's largest single donor for the last 9 years. Her name was on the visitor center. Her family foundation paid for the wildlife veterinary chair Angie herself sat in. Every fall, the sanctuary held a fundraising gala at her ranch outside Reno, and Rachel gave a small speech about her late father, who had loved cats of all sizes, and the crowd applauded and the checks came in. "She donates to us," Joel said stupidly, and then hated himself for saying it, because he already knew that donation and cover were often the same word wearing different clothes. "She donates to a lot of places," Angie said, "but she also owns other things I don't think our board of directors knows about." "You've been looking at this before now," Joel said. It was not a question. Angie hesitated. She was a person who never hesitated, and the pause of it was a small physical thing that hung in the room like a caught breath. "I need to talk to you," she said, "but not here." They drove out to the West Boundary Road at lunchtime, past the burn scar where the fire had come closest to the visitor center. The air smelled like wet ash and diesel, and the strange, sharp scent that comes off a scorched sagebrush plain. Angie parked at the edge of the ridge road, killed the engine, and did not speak for a long moment. Then she said her mother's maiden name was Whitmore. She said Rachel Whitmore was her aunt. She said she had grown up in that Reno ranch house every other Christmas as a child, and had stopped going when she was 15, and had not spoken to Rachel in 11 years. "I came to Redstone on purpose," she said, quiet, staring out through the windshield at the black hillside. "I took this job on purpose. My aunt gave me $100,000 for veterinary school on the condition that I never work at any of her facilities. That's what she called them, facilities. She never said the word sanctuary, and she never said the word zoo. I thought that was strange when I was 22. I understood it a lot better by the time I was 28. "You think she's running something," Joel said. "I don't think it. I've been trying to prove it for 3 years. Every time I've gotten close, the paperwork has moved. Every time I've asked a question at a board meeting, our own director has told me to focus on my job. Paul Kessler has been running interference for her since before I got here." Joel felt his hands tighten on the steering wheel. Paul Kessler had been the director of Redstone for almost 7 years, hired the same summer that Rachel Whitmore's donations had jumped from small to enormous. Kessler was a 58-year-old career administrator who wore expensive boots and drove a truck that no salary at Redstone should have paid for. "What was the surgery on the cub?" Joel said. "That scar on his shoulder." Angie let out a breath. "I think it was a chip removal or a chip replacement. Somebody was hiding something on that little animal, and somebody else tried to hide the evidence of the first hiding, and it was done recently enough that the surgery site hadn't fully quieted down yet. Do we still have the chip?" Angie reached into her jacket pocket and produced a tiny plastic bag. Inside it was a rice grain-sized capsule, faintly grey. "I found this last night. It fell out of the surgical site when I was cleaning him. Whoever did the work on him wasn't a professional, or they were rushed. And I ran it through the reader this morning. It's not one of ours." She named the registration number on the chip. Joel wrote it down on the back of a receipt. It was a private breeder registry number, and the prefix belonged to a chain of private hunting preserves that had been shut down 4 years earlier by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service after a scandal involving illegal transport of protected species across state lines. "Delta didn't just carry a lost cub out of the fire," Joel said slowly. "She carried a piece of evidence. Yes, she came to my porch. Yes. She knew what she was doing." Angie was quiet for a while. Then she said, "Animals know a lot more than we give them credit for. And Delta has been at Redstone since she was 2 years old. She has known you since her 3rd year. She knew where the fence line was. She knew where the safe places were. She had a fire behind her and a cub in her mouth, and she went to the human being she trusted most on this whole property. That is not a mystery to me. That is a fact." Joel did not answer for a long moment. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and flat. "Okay, then we don't let her down." That was the beginning of the 2nd week. It was also the end of anything simple. The cub grew steadier every day. Angie put him on a careful bottle rotation and moved his crate into the small, dark, heated room they used for orphaned raccoons and skunks in the spring. She had refused to name him at first, saying that names made things harder if things went sideways, but on the 5th night she gave in, because Joel had come in at midnight to check on him and found himself calling the cub Little Friend without meaning to. She wrote the name on a piece of blue tape and stuck it to the crate. Ember. It was a name for a thing that had been in a fire and had not gone out. Joel started, quietly, without telling anyone, to go through the sanctuary's records. He did it after his shifts in the small back office with the door closed, using the old paper duty logs going back 15 years. The digital records had been cleaned. He knew this because he found gaps in dates that made no sense and reference numbers that pointed to files that no longer existed. But the paper logs had never been touched. That was old Marcus Rayner's insistence. Marcus had grown up on ranches in Montana and had never trusted a computer for anything more important than a shopping list. The paper logs told a slow, ugly story. There was a section of the North Ridge on the property, 70 acres of scrub and pine, that had been officially marked as maintenance access only since about 8 years back. There had been budget line items for fencing, for water lines, for a dedicated feed shed, and there had been staffing hours logged against a habitat identifier that Joel had never seen before. The identifier was N4. Redstone had 3 enclosures for its Lion program, labeled N1 through N3. There should not have been an N4, but there it was, in Marcus Rayner's handwriting, going back nearly a decade. Weekly feed drops, quarterly veterinary walkarounds. Once, an entry in the margin, in what looked like Marcus's slower and more careful hand. Ask PK about Sable. Sable, a name for an animal. And Sable's habitat identifier, N4, sat squarely in the 70 acres that had burned to nothing the night Delta came out of the smoke. Joel sat with that name for a long time. He drove up to the North Ridge the next afternoon under the cover of a routine erosion survey. The Bureau of Land Management crew was still up there, taking soil samples. The place was moonscape. The trees had gone up like matches, and the ground was still hot in spots, still leaking smoke through the ash. But at the edge of the burn, in the small drawer the fire had somehow spared, Joel found a section of chain-link fencing lying flat, its base cut clean. Not melted, not warped, cut with a bolt cutter before the fire had ever come through. Somebody had opened that fence on purpose. Somebody had let something out. He photographed it with his own phone and drove back down. He did not tell anybody except Angie. That night, Paul Kessler called him at home. "I understand you were on the ridge today," Kessler said. "Erosion follow-up," Joel said. "That's a burn area now. It's federal jurisdiction until they release it back to us. I don't want any of my staff up there without me knowing." "You didn't want us up there before it burned either, Paul." The silence on the other end of the line was small and sharp. "I don't like your tone, Joel. You've had a hard week. Take tomorrow off." "I've got a cub to feed." "Dr. Dowd can feed the cub. Take the day. That's an order." Joel took the day. He did not sit at home. He drove 3 hours south to Carson City and pulled the incorporation records on Whitmore Wildlife Holdings. The company was registered to an address that turned out to be a mailbox at a UPS store in a strip mall. But the state filing listed 3 officers. One was Rachel Whitmore, one was her longtime attorney, and one was Paul Kessler. Joel stood in the parking lot of the county records office in the flat white winter light and understood, in that quiet, cold way that big understandings arrive, that his boss was not just an accessory. His boss was a partner. He drove home the long way. He made himself eat a sandwich. He called Angie and told her what he had found, and she went silent for so long that he thought the call had dropped. Then she said, "Joel, I need to bring you in on something. My phone is not the place." They met at a diner off the interstate the next morning. Angie was not alone. Sitting across from her in a booth by the back window was a woman in her 40s with short dark hair and a plain jacket over a plain shirt. She stood up when Joel came in and extended her hand. "Kate Alvarez," she said, "U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service." Joel sat. He looked at Angie. Angie held his eye without apology. "I told you I've been trying to prove it for 3 years," Angie said. "This is the person I've been proving it to." Kate Alvarez took a folder out from beside her on the bench and laid it flat on the table. There were photographs in it. There were photographs of the North Ridge, taken from a light aircraft months before the fire. In one of them, plainly visible against the scrub, was a large lioness older than Delta, thicker in the shoulder, walking along a fence line in an enclosure that officially did not exist. Sable. "We've had a file open on your aunt for 4 years," Kate said to Angie, and then turned her calm grey eyes on Joel. "We've had a file open on your director for a little over 1. What we haven't had is a witness inside the sanctuary who was willing to formally cooperate. Angie has been giving us pieces, but you, Ranger Harker, are the one who actually walked up on that fence line and saw what had been done to it. That makes you material." Joel looked at the photographs. He thought about Marcus Rayner and about a hunting accident that had never quite added up. He thought about 11 years of paychecks from a man who was in a photograph with a mailbox company. He thought about Delta walking out of the smoke and setting a small piece of contraband life at his boots. "What do you need me to do?" Joel said, and it did not come out as a question. They laid it out for him in low voices over cold coffee. Kate's task force had enough on Kessler to charge him. They had enough on Whitmore Holdings to open an operation on Rachel. What they did not have yet was enough to prove that the fourth lion, the one called Sable, was still alive and had been moved off the property before the fire. Because if Sable was alive, then the smuggling operation was ongoing. If Sable was dead, then the whole thing was cold case territory, and Rachel's lawyers would slow it down until nothing came of it. "She's alive," Angie said quietly. "The cub is proof. He was 6 weeks old at most when Delta brought him in. Sable was the only registered lioness of childbearing age in that facility. She was moved recently." "Then we need her," Kate said. "Physical animal, somewhere on Whitmore property. We can't get a warrant on suspicion alone. We need a location tied to Rachel." "How much time do we have?" Joel said. Kate's face did something small and unhappy. "The fire is going to accelerate this. Rachel's people know you've been on the ridge. They know an official investigation is going to reach the burn area soon. They will move Sable again, and they will move her fast. And if we don't find her in the next 2 weeks, she is going to disappear into the private collection market, and we will never see her again." Joel drove back to Redstone with his heart beating slow and hard. He passed the highway sign for the sanctuary and thought about turning around. He did not turn around. The next 4 days went by in a strange kind of hush. Joel did his job. He fed the animals. He checked the fence lines. He did not go anywhere near the North Ridge. He stopped at Angie's lab twice a day and looked in on Ember, who was strong now, all 4 paws under him, batting a soft toy Angie had brought from home. The cub had a small white patch on his chest and a habit of chirping like a bird when he wanted attention. And Joel found, without quite meaning to, that he had started thinking of the cub as something other than a case file. Paul Kessler smiled at Joel in the hallway. Joel smiled back. It did not reach either of their eyes. On the 5th day, Kate Alvarez called Joel on a burner phone she had given him. "We got a hit," she said. 2 nights ago, a livestock trailer left a private facility in Winnemucca under an anonymous LLC that traces back to Whitmore. The registration was hasty. The plates don't match the vehicle." "Where did it go?" "That's what I need to tell you. It went to the Whitmore estate outside Reno, the one your aunt hosts the sanctuary fundraiser at every October." Joel almost laughed. It was that kind of information, not the funny kind, the kind of thing that walks out of the smoke and sets itself at your feet. "Get me a warrant," he said. "I can't get a warrant on that alone. I need physical confirmation. I need eyes on the animal. You want me to trespass on Rachel Whitmore's ranch?" Kate did not answer immediately. When she did, she said, "I want you to go to the sanctuary fundraiser next Friday." It's on her calendar. It's on the sanctuary calendar. You would be an invited guest. She won't turn you away without making a scene, and she doesn't want a scene right now. Once you're on the property, if you were to happen to walk somewhere you shouldn't, and if you were to happen to see an animal you shouldn't see, That would be a citizen observation that a federal officer could use to obtain a warrant. Kate, I'm not asking you to do anything I wouldn't do. Joel sat with the phone against his ear and looked out the office window at the acacia grove far across the meadow, where Delta had taken her afternoon nap in the shade. From this distance, she looked like any lioness in any zoo. She looked like a screensaver. She looked like a promise. I'll go, he said. 2 days before the fundraiser, someone shot at his truck. He was on the county road 1/2 mile from the sanctuary gate at dusk. He heard the crack of a rifle, and the driver's side mirror exploded outward, and the truck slewed. Joel got the truck stopped in the ditch without flipping and lay flat across the bench seat for a full minute, waiting for a second shot. The second shot did not come. Whoever had done it had wanted to send a message, not a body. He limped the truck back to the ranger station. He called Kate first. He called Angie second. He did not call the sheriff because he did not know yet how far Kessler's arm reached. I'm coming out there, Kate said. No, Joel said. You come out here now. You burn the operation. I'm going to the fundraiser. Joel, I'm going to the fundraiser. The night of the gala, Rachel Whitmore's Reno estate glowed like a small town. There were fairy lights strung through the cottonwoods, and a big white tent set up on the south lawn, and a live jazz trio playing softly under strings of paper lanterns. Rachel herself stood at the entrance in a long, deep green dress, a woman of 62 with silver white hair pinned up in a knot, greeting each guest by name. She smiled warmly when she saw Joel. She kissed him on the cheek. Joel Harker, she said. Our Ranger of the Year, every year. Come in, get a drink. Thank you for having me, Ms. Whitmore. Rachel, I've told you that 100 times. Rachel. He drifted through the tent and shook the hands he was supposed to shake and smiled at the board members he was supposed to smile at. He saw Paul Kessler across the tent in a linen jacket, laughing at something the mayor of Reno had said. Kessler saw him, too. Kessler raised a glass. At 8:30 in the evening, Joel excused himself to the restroom and did not come back through the tent. He went instead around the outside of the main house, past a low, ornamental hedge, down a stone path that ran along the north edge of the property. The property was 36 acres. Most of it was landscaped. But the far northeast corner, behind a screen of tall pines, was fenced off with a high chain-link boundary and a sign that read, Private, in polite black lettering, as if the sign were merely being nice. Joel walked the fence in the dark. The moon was a thin sliver. He kept low and slow. The ground was soft with pine duff. When he reached the far side of the enclosure, he could see, in a beam of security light coming off a barn roof, a low structure that looked like a livestock-holding pen retrofitted with steel walls and a heavy sliding door. And in front of that structure, standing at the fence line of a small dirt yard, watching the moon, was a lioness. She was older than Delta. She was thicker in the shoulder. She was thinner in the belly than she should have been. She had a scar on her right hind leg that he had seen in Kate's aerial photograph. Sable. Joel's whole body went hot and then cold and then very quiet. He lifted his phone. He took 11 photographs in 3 seconds. He was already backing away when the security light on the barn came on and swept sideways toward him. He ran. He ran through the pines and down the stone path and around the back of the guest cottages, and by the time he got back into the party tent, he was sweating through his shirt collar and had a smear of pine sap on his sleeve. Rachel Whitmore was on the small stage, speaking to the crowd, thanking them all for their loyal support of Redstone. She saw him come in. She smiled at him from the stage. She did not miss a beat. She said the sanctuary had been through a difficult season, but the important thing was that everyone in this room understood the value of what they were protecting. Joel walked out to the parking lot and drove down the mountain and sent the photographs to Kate Alvarez from a gas station 40 minutes later. Kate called him back within 2 minutes. "That's her," Kate said. "That's Sable." "Do we have enough now?" "We have plenty." On Monday morning, before the sun was fully up, federal agents served warrants at 3 locations at once: the Whitmore Reno estate, Paul Kessler's home outside the sanctuary, and the office of Whitmore Wildlife Holdings in Carson City. Sable was recovered alive. 2 other cats, a young leopard and a caracal that had never appeared on any legal manifest, were recovered from a warehouse in Winnemucca the same afternoon. Paul Kessler was walked out of his living room in his bathrobe. Rachel Whitmore was arrested at her breakfast table. Joel watched none of it in person. He watched it through the live feed of a helicopter pool camera on a small television in Angie's lab, sitting on a stool next to Ember's crate. The cub sat on his haunches and blinked up at him. Joel put his fingers through the mesh, and the cub batted at them with a soft, heavy paw. "We did it," Angie said from the doorway. Her voice was thin, not thin from fear, thin from the kind of exhaustion that 11 years of one thing produces in a single moment of release. "Not yet," Joel said, "but close." He was more right than he knew. Rachel Whitmore was released on bond within 18 hours. Her lawyers had been ready. They had a team of 5 in the courtroom by 10 in the morning, and by noon she was sitting on her patio again, drinking coffee and looking at the mountains. Her passport was surrendered. Her business accounts were frozen. Her ranch was under continuous federal observation, but she was, technically and inconveniently, free. That was not the worst part. The worst part came 3 days later, when the interim director appointed by the Sanctuary Board, a man named Craig Turnbull, a former hedge fund officer who had somehow ended up on non-profit boards in 3 western states, walked into Joel's station and handed him a letter of suspension. The letter said Joel Harker was placed on unpaid administrative leave, pending a review of unauthorized inquiry, unauthorized cooperation with an outside agency, and possible violation of employment terms. The letter also said the cub in the sanctuary's care would be transferred, effective the following Friday, to a partner facility in New Mexico. As a precaution, chain of custody. Joel read the letter twice. Then he set it down flat on his desk and looked up at Turnbull. "You know where that facility routes its animals," Joel said. "That is not my concern," Turnbull said, "and it is not yours. You know Rachel Whitmore has a controlling interest in the parent company of that facility. I don't know anything of the kind, Ranger Harker, and frankly, that kind of accusation is exactly what put you on leave in the first place. I would encourage you to spend the next several days thinking about your career." Turnbull walked out. Joel sat behind his desk for a long time. Angie came into his office half an hour later. Her face was set the way faces set when they are about to break. "They're going to take him, Joel." "I know. They're going to disappear him. They can't touch the physical evidence that's already in federal custody, but they can absolutely lose one small living animal who is technically the property of a state-chartered non-profit whose acting director signs the paperwork." "I know, Angie. Then what do we do? What do—" Joel did not answer immediately. He was looking out the small window of his office at the far meadow. Delta was out there, in the last of the afternoon light, lying on her side under an acacia. She had been quiet since the arrests. She had been quiet, in fact, since the night of the fire. She had done what she came to do. She had trusted her small piece of evidence to the human being she trusted most on this property, and the human being had, thus far, kept his promise. And now the promise was slipping. "I don't know yet," Joel said, "but we have 3 days." That evening, someone slashed the tires on Angie's car in the sanctuary parking lot. In the middle of the night, someone called Joel's cabin phone twice from a blocked number and hung up both times. Kate Alvarez called at 6 the next morning and told him her supervisor had received a formal complaint from the Sanctuary Board accusing her of exceeding her jurisdiction and coercing a civilian informant. It would go nowhere, but it would slow her down for at least a week. And a week was more time than Joel had, because a week was longer than a Friday. At 10 o'clock in the morning, on the day before the cub was scheduled to be transferred, Delta broke through a fence line and made her way to the front door of the ranger station for the second time in her life. She was calm about it. She had gone through the internal boundary between her habitat and the maintenance corridor, and the boundary had been in poor repair since the fire, and she had chosen a spot where the mesh was loose and simply pushed her way through it. She had walked across the maintenance corridor and along the meadow path and up to the front step of the North Ranger Station, and there she had stopped, and there she had sat, and there she had waited. Joel opened the door. She was carrying something in her mouth. She set it on the step and backed away 2 paces, the same way she had done the first time. She looked at him with the same steady amber eyes. The thing on the step was a scrap of black nylon. It had been buried, or half buried. Dirt still clung to it. There was a small metal ring attached to it, and a broken plastic housing and a partial serial number etched into the plastic. It was a piece of a collar, a satellite tracking collar, not one Redstone had ever used. Joel picked it up with a shaking hand. He looked at Delta. Delta stood, turned, and walked back down the path toward the meadow. She did not look back. He watched her go until she disappeared into the tall grass. He drove into the burn area on the North Ridge without permission from anyone. He drove up to the collapsed section of fence and beyond it, into the sagebrush draw where the small pond had been. He walked in a widening circle, watching the ground. In the shade of a burned pine, at the base of a stump the fire had somehow left intact, he found a shallow depression in the earth where a collar might have been dug up. Delta had unearthed it. She had gone out of her enclosure, walked through the maintenance corridor, dug up an object she had known was there, and carried it to the human being she trusted most on this property. She had done all of it in a single morning. She had done all of it without prompting. She had done all of it while a scheduled transfer of her cub was 30 hours away. Joel put the collar fragment in an evidence bag and drove into Reno at 85 miles an hour. Kate Alvarez read the serial number and closed her eyes. That is a private tracking collar, manufactured by a company that services high-net-worth private collectors. It is not sold to sanctuaries. It is not sold to zoos. It is sold to people who own animals they are not supposed to own. And this specific one, she tapped the partial number. This specific one was registered 5 years ago to a lioness known in that database as Sable One. That name has been floating around our task force files for 4 years. We could never tie it to a real animal in a real place. Now you can, Joel said. Now we can. Kate got up from her desk. She was already reaching for the phone. The GPS memory on these collars persists for up to 90 days after removal. If we can get the housing into our forensic lab tonight, we can pull the last 90 days of location data off it. That means we know every place Sable was kept, every warehouse, every ranch, every truck route. That is not one warrant. That is a network. How fast can you do it? By morning. The cub is scheduled for pickup at noon tomorrow. Kate looked at him a long moment. We will make the deadline. Joel drove back to Redstone in the dark. He did not go home. He went to Angie's lab and sat with Ember, and Angie brought him a cup of coffee, and neither of them said anything for a long time. Around midnight, the cub climbed out of his crate and walked stiff-legged across the floor and curled up under Joel's chair, and slept there, and made a small snoring sound that no lion in a documentary has ever made. He does that with me too, Angie said quietly. Yeah, he picks. Yeah. They both watched the cub sleep. Outside, a wind had come up off the ridge, and a loose piece of tin on the equipment shed was tapping once every few seconds against a rafter. Joel closed his eyes and listened to it and thought about Delta lying under the acacia at sunset, and about Marcus Rayner's small pencil notation in a duty log 8 years old. Ask PK about Sable, and about the way the world sometimes hands you a puzzle when you are still holding your coffee, and how the puzzle turns out to be the shape of a person's whole life. At 6 o'clock in the morning, Kate Alvarez called with 2 words: "We're moving." By 9, federal warrants had been served at 4 additional locations across Nevada, Arizona, and Eastern California. 6 large cats and 11 smaller protected species were recovered alive. 2 veterinarians on private retainer to Whitmore Holdings were arrested. Craig Turnbull, the interim sanctuary director, was arrested in the sanctuary parking lot at 9:45 while trying to load a personal file cabinet into his car. Paul Kessler, out on bond and wearing an ankle monitor, was rearrested at 10 because his ankle monitor placed him on a phone call from his kitchen with a driver of the very transport truck that had been scheduled to take Ember to New Mexico. Rachel Whitmore's bond was revoked at 10:30 in the morning by a federal judge, and by 11 she was in custody again, and this time her lawyers did not get her out. The truck that was supposed to arrive at noon did not arrive. At 12:15, Joel Harker was reinstated by an emergency vote of the Sanctuary Board. At 12:30, Kate Alvarez called him personally to tell him the operation was still expanding and that there would be many more arrests over the coming weeks. At 3 o'clock in the afternoon, Joel walked out to the acacia grove for the first time since the fire. Delta was there. She was lying in the shade with her front paws crossed. She looked at him. He stopped 10 yards away and looked back at her, and neither of them moved for a long moment. And then Joel simply said, out loud, in a voice that cracked in the middle of it, "Thank you." Delta rose slowly to her feet. She stretched and yawned and walked, deliberate and easy, deeper into the acacia trees, back toward the shaded pool where she liked to spend her afternoons. She did not look back. She did not need to. 3 weeks later, Ember was strong enough to go home. Sable had been placed under care at a specialist facility in Northern California. She was too old and too long in captivity to be released to a wild adjacent program. But the facility that took her was legitimate, expert, and permanent, and Kate Alvarez had visited it twice herself. Sable would live out her years there with the space and quiet she had never been given, and her cub, the small thing Delta had carried through the smoke, would grow up at Redstone in a rehabilitation habitat under the care of the only lioness who had ever put her body between him and the fire. Delta had accepted him back in a way that made a room full of veterinarians go quiet. On the day of the reintroduction, Angie's team carried Ember out into the secure inner habitat in a soft carrier and set the carrier down and stepped back. Delta had come out of the acacia trees at a slow, easy walk. She had approached the carrier. She had sniffed the small opening at the top. She had chirped once, low and soft, the way a lioness chirps to a cub of her own. And Ember, inside the carrier, had chirped back. Angie opened the carrier, Ember stepped out. Delta reached down and picked him up by the scruff, the way she had picked him up on the night of the fire, and she turned, and she walked him back toward the acacia grove at the far end of the enclosure, the same trees she had gone to that night, the same shaded pool she had rested by every afternoon for 8 of her 12 years. But this time, halfway across the meadow, Delta stopped. She set the cub down. She looked back over her shoulder, across the long grass, straight at Joel Harker, who was standing at the observation platform with his hands on the railing. She looked at him for the length of a breath, and then gently she picked her cub up again and disappeared into the trees. Joel stood on that platform for a long time after she was gone. 11 years at Redstone. He had never seen anything that clear. He thought about Marcus Rayner, and about a small pencil notation in a duty log. He thought about a woman in a long green dress smiling from a stage. He thought about a piece of chain-link fence lying flat in the sagebrush and about a scrap of black collar buried at the base of a burned pine stump. He thought about how a fire had come over the ridge one summer morning and how a lioness had walked through it with her mouth full of a small, living secret that a whole team of federal investigators had needed 4 years to name. He thought about how she had chosen him. Down in the acacia grove, out of sight, a cub chirped once. Delta answered. The sound carried across the meadow in the pale afternoon light and up to the platform where a man stood holding onto a railing with both hands, and it went into him the way certain sounds do. The ones you know you'll be able to hear 30 years later if you close your eyes and remember to listen. If this story stayed with you the way it stayed with him, leave a comment sharing the moment that got you. Share this with someone who needs to hear a story that ends with the right people carrying the right small lives. And subscribe so we can find each other again the next time a lioness walks out of the smoke.